In this lecture, we'll consider whether there is a critical period or a window of opportunity for children to acquire a first language. In 1968, Eric Lenneberg developed an older idea that there may be a critical period or window of opportunity for children to acquire language, after which the door to language learning was shut. And this became known as the critical period hypothesis. Of course, it would be completely unethical to test such a hypothesis, depriving a child of language just to see what happens, although one Egyptian pharaoh, Psammiticus I, tried this. He had a shepherd raise 2 babies in isolation, and he thought that the baby's first words would reveal the mother tongue of all the world's languages. One of the infants evidently said bekos, which means bread in Phrygian, a language of Turkey, and there the experiment ended. There are a number of different ideas about when the actual cutoff for the critical period is. And this is largely because it's the forbidden experiment. It's an experiment you can't possibly conduct. There are other known critical periods like imprinting, where there's a window of time for geese to imprint on a parent, a time period in which the neurological architecture of the eye is established, and that's why doctors try to get early screening for children whose eyes aren't in alignment. There are critical periods in gestation in which there's a timeline of development. Drugs that were introduced during a certain time in pregnancy, like thalidomide in the 1960s, had predictable effects in terms of birth defects. There appear to be windows for socialization in dogs and monkeys. Dogs who are abused early on in life never seem to be able to get over it. And in the 1960s, in the Harlow experiments, monkeys were raised in complete isolation, something called the pit of despair, and were never able to interact normally once they were removed from isolation. The experiment shown here shows monkeys prefer the softer mom to the wire mom with food. These critical periods have led some people to believe that there might be windows for math and music and all sorts of skills, causing an increase in popularity of enriching activities for children. It isn't really known if these exist and when they close, if at all. Certainly there's a number of companies that have used this trend to sell products. One piece of circumstantial evidence for the critical period hypothesis is the decline in second language skills with age. Scores for grammar decline with the age at which a person learns the language. So in studies of immigrants to the United States, the age of arrival is correlated strongly with a decline in understanding of grammar. The scores of adults who had emigrated to the United States before the age of 7 were indistinguishable from those of native English speakers, but beyond that there was a systematic decline in the grammatical scores. A similar trajectory can be seen in deaf adults who learn sign later on in life. They have a kind of accent and are never perfectly fluent. The decline is really interesting and suggests something special about childhood and language. Of course, it doesn't indicate whether someone with no language exposure at all during the critical period would be shut off from language forever. One really interesting case is the case of Chelsea, who was born deaf, but she was assumed to be mentally disabled, but was otherwise not abused. And she had no language until the age of 30 when she was taught ASL or American Sign Language. And yet she never became fluent or mastered complex grammar. She also had no hemispherical specialization, that is, she was not left hemisphere dominant for language. Other natural experiments, as they're called, include the wild boy of Aveyron, who stumbled out of the forest in a wild state, defecating where he was, scratching and biting. He was able to understand some language, but not able to produce it. Genie is perhaps the most famous case of all these cases. She was kept by her father, locked away from others until she was 13, and discovered in 1969. Genie didn't speak at all except for "stop it" and "no more." Genie couldn't chew properly, she couldn't stand erect, she wasn't toilet trained, and at 17 years old, after 4 years of training, She made great improvements in her vocabulary, but she still had the vocabulary of a 5-year-old. Genie's vocabulary was much larger than that of children at the same stage of syntactic development, that is, putting sentences together. So her vocabulary had improved, but the way she put sentences together was very limited. She did combine words in a kind of telegraphic speech, leaving out unnecessary words. Again, the grammar was deficient in production and comprehension, although, like children and, of course, like the ape language projects that we saw, her comprehension was greater than her production. She understood more than she could actually produce. And some things she never used, like question words, although she was able to comprehend them. Here's what Genie's telegraphic speech looked like. I supermarket surprise Roy. Want buy toy refrigerator. Want go walk Ralph's. Or want go shopping. Genie showed extreme left ear advantage on dichotic listening tests. And remember, those are the tests where you hear the sound in both ears simultaneously. And this suggests that her right hemisphere was dominant for language, because the sound in the left ear travels to the right hemisphere. And the left hemisphere wasn't involved in language processing. Genie was very proficient in right hemisphere functions like pattern recognition, and she scored the highest ever recorded on a spatial ability test. While these cases are suggestive, they aren't conclusive. Lenneberg himself observed that Genie's personal history was so disastrous that it would not be at all clear why she had been able to make more progress. For example, it's unclear whether Genie was mentally disabled from birth. Maybe her lack of language was a result of emotional abuse. Was her lack of language a result of not hearing much language? Was her lack of language a result of a combination of these? So Genie's case in the end was largely inconclusive, though suggestive that there may be some type of window for language learning, in that she was able to improve with vocabulary, but not with sentence structure.